In early September of 1999, 29-year-old Hannah Lane set out on a 4-day solo hike through the Ashenridge Ranges of Western Virginia. She was experienced, methodical, and had planned the route with precision. By Sunday evening, she was expected home. She never returned. Her maroon Honda sedan was found parked neatly at the East Gate trailhead, untouched. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, only silence. The question was simple and terrifying. Where had she gone? Hannah Lane wasn't reckless or naive. At 29, she was the kind of hiker who turned discipline into ritual. Friends remembered how she packed her gear with military precision, logged her routes in a small spiral notebook, and double-checked maps before lacing her boots. To those who knew her, Hannah was self-reliant, the sort of woman who could camp alone through storms without panic. On the morning of October 7th, she left her small rental home. Her Honda waited in the driveway, trunk packed neatly. Her younger sister, Ivy Monroe, waved from the porch as Hannah promised to call by Sunday night. Ivy teased her about carrying too many protein bars. Hannah laughed, brushing her copper hair into a braid. 4 days, that's all, she said. I'll call you Sunday evening. It was a routine farewell forgettable, ordinary, like 1,000 harmless trips before it. But Sunday came, and the phone never rang. By Monday morning, Ivy's concern hardened into fear. Hannah was predictable in the best way. She called when she said she would, showed up on time, never left anyone in silence. Ivy phoned the ranger station, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. "My sister's missing," she said. She gave the details. 29 years old, 5'6", athletic build, copper hair, last seen wearing a teal hiking jacket. Destination, Eastgate Trailhead, 15 miles beyond the last paved road. A ranger drove out to check. By late afternoon, the call came back. The Honda was there, locked, undisturbed, a fine layer of dust and pine pollen coating the windshield, as though it had sat untouched for days. Inside, nothing but a folded blanket on the back seat. No broken glass, no forced entry. To the ranger, it looked unremarkable. To Ivy, it was catastrophic. Hannah would never leave her car alone for days, unless something had gone terribly wrong. October 12th marked the official start of the search. The Ashenridge Ranges stretched for miles, dense forests of oak and pine, broken by steep ravines and narrow ridges threaded with forgotten logging roads. Rangers, sheriff's deputies, and volunteers formed search grids. GPS units clipped to their belts. K9 handlers unclipped leashes dogs, bounding into the brush. Helicopters thumped overhead, rotors stirring leaves into frantic spirals. The first day, they expected something obvious: a misplaced water bottle, a footprint pressed into mud, a snapped branch hinting at struggle. But the forest gave nothing back. Every trail led only to silence. By dusk, the volunteers trudged back to the gravel lot, faces drawn, voices low. That evening, Ivy arrived clutching a photograph of her sister, taken just weeks before. Hannah on a rock, sunlight spilling through her copper hair, a red flannel tied around her waist. She looked strong, steady, alive. Ivy made copies, pressing them into every searcher's hands. "Remember her," she pleaded. "Don't let her disappear." For 5 days the operation continued. Radio chatter filled the air. Men and women swept through gullies, calling her name. The dogs sniffed tirelessly until they collapsed from exhaustion. Helicopters scanned the canopy, infrared cameras searching for heat signatures. Each day ended the same. Nothing. On the 6th day, hope flickered. A searcher found a scrap of teal fabric tangled in underbrush nearly 7 miles off Hannah's intended route. Could it be her jacket? But analysis under a field scope crushed the moment. The fibers were too coarse, synthetic, more like tarp than clothing. Not Hannah, not a clue, just another cruel trick of the forest. By October 17th, the search scaled back. Storms built to the west, threatening to flood ravines and bury evidence beneath mudslides. The sheriff's office issued a statement. The active search was suspended pending new leads. For officials, it was procedure. For Ivy, it was abandonment. She lingered long after others left, staring at Hannah's car, the windshield now littered with fallen leaves. The rangers packed up tents. Radios went silent. Helicopters faded into memory. The forest stood unmoved, swallowing sound and light alike. Weeks became months. Flyers with Hannah's face appeared at gas stations, on telephone poles, inside diners. Local news ran her story nightly, then less, then not at all. As winter deepened, coverage faded. People moved on, wrapping themselves in routine, while one family remained frozen in time. Ivy did not move on. She called the sheriff's office weekly, filed records requests, pieced together her own case file. She returned to the trailhead lot where Hannah's car had been found, standing before the empty space as if it were a grave without a body. But the forest remained silent. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded gear. It was as if Hannah Lane had been erased. Some whispered theories: an animal attack, a fall into one of the region's hidden crevices, or a voluntary disappearance. Ivy rejected all of them. Hannah wouldn't walk away. She wouldn't leave her family behind. If the woods had taken her, then the woods had hidden her. By the end of 1999, Ashenridge carried a new reputation. Parents warned children not to wander too far. Hikers avoided Eastgate, and locals spoke in low tones of the woman who had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the silence of the trees. The story could have ended there, but it didn't. Because years later, long after the flyers had yellowed and the case file was shelved, new evidence surfaced. Evidence suggesting that Hannah Lane hadn't died in 1999 at all. She had lived, and someone else had been watching. Before Hannah Lane became a name on missing person posters, she was a daughter, a sister, and a familiar face in the quiet town of Blackwood, Virginia. To understand the impact of her disappearance, you have to understand who she was and what the Lane family meant in that small, steady corner of the world. The Lanes were not remarkable by outward standards. Caleb Lane, the father, served as a lay minister at the local chapel, a man known for his reliability rather than passion. May Lane, the mother, was quieter still, her health fragile, but her smile unfailing. Their household was modest, stable, predictable, the rhythm of a town where change rarely came. Hannah, the eldest daughter, stood out for her movement. While others built lives around family businesses or teaching at the local school, she measured her life in miles. Hiking wasn't just a hobby. It was her language, the way she tested herself against the world. She had years of wilderness experience skills that made her confident where others felt fear. Neighbors called her practical, disciplined, dependable. Her younger sister, Ivy, was the opposite: quieter, bookish, content with small routines. She worked at the local library and admired Hannah deeply, though she rarely said it aloud. It was Hannah who'd pressed a compass into her palm when they were kids, saying, "If you can read this, you'll never be lost." Ivy never forgot. That's what made her disappearance so impossible to accept. In the fall of 1999, when Hannah announced her plan for a solo hike in the Ashenridge Ranges, no one was surprised. It was standard for her to leave detailed itineraries with Ivy, to promise a check-in call on her return. This time was no different. She mapped her route, packed her gear, and said with a smile, 4 days. I'll be back Sunday. Sunday came and went. When her car was found parked neatly at the trailhead keys, still in her packed confusion turned to dread. For a woman like Hannah, organized and consistent, silence wasn't just alarming, it was unthinkable. The Lane family fractured overnight. May sat at the kitchen table, staring at the telephone as if she could will it to ring. Caleb withdrew into silence, a man of faith now confronted with uncertainty. And Ivy acted. She called the sheriff's office. She drove to the trailhead. She pressed her palms to the cold hood of Hannah's car, as if the metal could still hold warmth, as if it might whisper where her sister had gone. The community responded quickly. Blackwood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where a missing person was everyone's tragedy. Park rangers, deputies, volunteers, even out-of-town hikers joined the search. Flyers filled windows, prayer circles formed at the chapel. For weeks, it felt as if the entire town moved in rhythm with the Lane family's desperation. Helicopters scanned the canopy. K-9 units traced scent trails that vanished into dead ends. Volunteers combed ridgelines with flashlights. Each night, Ivy came home exhausted, but unable to rest. She called news stations, pleaded with reporters, knocked on neighbors' doors to keep Hannah's name alive. But as days became weeks and weeks turned into months, the energy faded. The search produced nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no broken branches. It was as if Hannah had stepped into the woods and been erased. The absence of evidence was more disturbing than any sign of violence. People began to whisper that maybe she'd chosen to disappear, or that the forest had swallowed her whole. For the Lanes, such whispers cut deep. Hannah wasn't the type to abandon responsibility. She wouldn't have left without a word. She didn't disappear, Ivy said quietly. Something happened to her. By the spring of 2000, vigils that once drew crowds dwindled to a handful of attendees. Flyers curled and faded. Parents warned daughters not to hike alone. Shops reopened. Children played again. Conversations drifted to other things. But for Ivy, time stopped. She returned to the trailhead often, laying flowers where the car had once been parked, a shrine to the last place Hannah was known to exist. Her persistence contrasted painfully with her parents' decline. May grew weaker, retreating into silence. Caleb's sermons lost their hope, and Ivy carried the case alone. Neighbors began to see her not just as the missing woman's sister, but as the woman who couldn't let go. Some admired her determination. Others pitied her. A few resented it. "She's gone," one neighbor said gently, "and Ivy's the only one who can't accept it." But Ivy refused resignation. Every week she called the sheriff's office. Every month she printed new flyers. "If I stop," she told them, "then Hannah really is gone, and I can't let that happen." The Lane home, once ordinary, became a monument to absence. Hannah's bedroom stayed untouched, her journals stacked neatly, her hiking gear folded in drawers. Ivy often sat there, leafing through notebooks filled with trail sketches and gear lists, listening for her sister's voice between the lines. What burned most wasn't only that Hannah was gone, it was that she'd been the least likely person to vanish. Cautious, skilled, careful. If anyone could survive, it was her. That paradox haunted Ivy most of all. By the end of 2000, Ashenridge had grown quiet again. But inside the Lane household, silence roared. By the fall of 2001, the story of Hannah Lane had faded from headlines. Her name still lingered in Blackwood's memory, but it no longer carried urgency. Her case sat in a drawer marked "Suspended, pending new evidence." Then, another woman went missing. Her name was Tara Calloway, 34 years old, a school teacher from a town south of Ashenridge. Unlike Hannah, she wasn't known as an experienced hiker, though she enjoyed weekend treks. On an October morning in 2001, Tara set out for a day hike in the lower stretches of the Ashenridge woods, telling friends she'd be home by evening. When she didn't return, her car was found near a remote trailhead locked, untouched, eerily familiar. The search looked almost identical to the one 2 years before. Rangers, deputies, and volunteers combed the trails. Helicopters hovered low. K-9 units swept through ravines. And then, 5 days in, they found her. A volunteer stumbled across disturbed earth in a clearing less than a mile from the main path. The soil was shallow, hastily covered with branches and moss. Inside lay the body of Tara Calloway. The signs of violence were unmistakable: blunt force trauma, ligature marks, a hurried burial. This wasn't an accident, it was murder. News spread quickly. Headlines called it a brutal but isolated tragedy. But for some, the echoes of 1999 were impossible to ignore. A woman alone, a car left untouched, a forest with too many secrets. One man couldn't ignore it at all. Detective Connor Hale. At 45, Hale worked in the state's major crimes unit. He was methodical, patient to the point of obsession. His desk was buried beneath case files, each covered in handwritten notes. Where others saw dead ends, Hale saw patterns. When Tara Calloway's case landed on his desk, he read the reports with growing unease. The details matched Hannah Lane's disappearance almost perfectly. The difference was simple. Tara had been found. Hannah had not. Hale drove out to Ashenridge to see the scene himself. At first glance, it was just another patch of forest quiet, unremarkable. But the grave told a different story. The burial was sloppy. Whoever had placed her there wasn't careful or skilled in concealment. They hadn't expected to be discovered. Maybe they'd been interrupted. That carelessness stood in sharp contrast to the Lane case. In 1999, there had been no evidence, no body, no struggle, nothing. It was, in investigative terms, clean. Hale began to wonder, what if these weren't isolated tragedies? What if they were connected 2 chapters of the same story? Maybe the man who killed Tara Calloway had taken Hannah Lane first. Maybe in 1999 he'd gotten away clean. And in 2001 he slipped. Back at his office, Hale pulled Hannah's old file. He spread the documents across his desk: the missing person report, search maps, photographs of her car at the trailhead. Side by side with Tara's file, the similarities were chilling. Women hiking alone, remote entry points, no robbery, no clear motive, no witnesses. But what struck him most wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. In Hannah's case, there was no evidence of a struggle, no discarded belongings, no sign she'd fought back. It was as if she'd simply been erased. In Hale's mind, that wasn't random, that was skill. He wrote in an internal memo, "The Calloway burial is sloppy. It suggests loss of control or escalation. The Lane disappearance leaves nothing. That's not luck. That's intent. He began to see Hannah not as a lost hiker, but as a predator's first known victim. To test his theory, Hale reconstructed the timeline. October 1999. Hannah enters the Eastgate trailhead. Her car is parked beneath the trees. 4 days planned. She never returns. October 2001. Tara Calloway enters the southern stretch of Ashenridge. She never comes out. If a predator had been active, Hannah might have been the beginning. And if that predator was still out there, Tara's death might not be the end. When Hale contacted Ivy Monroe, she was cautious but hopeful. For 2 years, she'd been dismissed as the obsessive sister who couldn't move on. Now, finally, someone in authority was listening. She handed him binders filled with clippings, notes, and timelines she'd built herself. "You're the first one who hasn't told me to forget her," she said quietly. Hale studied every page. He pinned photos of both women to his wall, marked their last known locations on a map of Ashenridge. 2 points, 2 years apart, a pattern forming. If Hannah Lane had been the first, had she really died in 1999? Or had she been kept alive hidden somewhere in that vast, indifferent wilderness? By 2005, the disappearance of Hannah Lane had settled into local legend, a ghost story whispered over campfires. The frenzy of '99 was long gone. Even Tara Calloway's murder had faded from public memory. But Detective Hale hadn't let go. He spent 4 years connecting the dots, convinced that Hannah hadn't been lost by accident, but taken. He studied maps of Ashenridge like scripture, tracing every possible route she might have walked, every ravine where someone could vanish. Then, in the spring of 2005, the forest shifted. A landslide exposed something unexpected, a deep fissure in the ground, a narrow shaft plunging straight into darkness. Locals called it a sinkhole. Hale called it a lead. Rope teams were lowered inside. Their flashlights cut through 50 feet of cold air before reaching the bottom. There, scattered across damp soil, they found fragments. A torn hiking pack, a crumpled teal jacket, and wedged between rocks, a small plastic radio its casing scratched, antenna bent, but still faintly humming. The pack bore faded initials stitched into the fabric. HL. The jacket matched the description from Hannah's last hike. But it was the radio that changed everything. Inside, the batteries weren't original. They were lithium AAs manufactured in 2003, and lab tests showed they'd been inserted no earlier than 2004. That meant only one thing. The radio had been turned on years after Hannah disappeared. She had lived. For Hale, it was vindication and horror. His theory was no longer speculation. It was fact. Hannah Lane had survived at least 5 years beyond the date everyone thought she'd died. When Ivy Monroe was told, she broke down completely. For 6 years, she'd insisted her sister was alive. Now she held the teal fabric of the jacket in her hands, whispering through tears. She tried to reach us. She was calling for help. But the discovery raised darker questions. The items at the bottom of the shaft didn't look like the debris of an accident. The radio had been deliberately wedged between stones, angled to maximize signal. That wasn't despair. That was strategy. And then there were the footprints. 2 sets, faint but distinct, preserved in soil shielded from rain. One small, narrow female, the other larger, heavier male. Both old, degraded by time. But they were there. If Hannah had fallen, she'd survived the impact. If she'd survived, she'd radioed for help. And if she'd radioed, someone else had been there, either helping her or keeping her trapped. For years, people had assumed Hannah was dead. Now, evidence said otherwise. But instead of relief, the revelation deepened the mystery. Who had changed the batteries? Who had left those footprints? The search widened around the shaft. Rope teams explored nearby fissures. Some led to dead ends. Others vanished into tunnels too narrow to navigate. Forensic teams found no bones, no personal effects beyond the pack and jacket. Hannah herself was gone. When the findings were released, Ashenridge reacted with disbelief. For many, the case had been closed in their minds. To hear that Hannah might have lived until 2004 or 2005 was unsettling. Some clung to hope. Others recoiled at what those missing years might mean. Ivy refused to waver. She stood before cameras holding the teal jacket, her voice fierce through tears. My sister was alive. She fought to come back to us. If she isn't here, it's because someone made sure of it. The Stygian Chasm, as locals came to call the sinkhole, became both a monument and a wound. For Hale, it was evidence of a predator. For Ivy, it was proof of Hannah's will to survive. For the town, it was a reminder that the forest didn't just take it concealed. And then came the question no one wanted to say aloud. If Hannah Lane had lived at least until 2005, where was she now? For months, the investigation moved with new urgency. Hale spent long nights in the evidence lab, staring at the jacket laid out under glass, the scratched radio sealed in plastic, the photographs of footprints that refused to fade from his mind. It was no longer if she had survived. It was how long, and under what conditions. But as 2006 unfolded, the case began to stall again. Teams searched every cave near the chasm. Nothing. Dogs swept the valleys. Silence. Fragments. Possibilities, but never Hannah herself. And then a chance discovery. A retired forester named Gerald Rains, clearing storm debris from his property on the southern edge of Ashenridge, retrieved several old trail cameras he'd set years earlier to track deer migration. Most were long dead. One, however, still worked. When he loaded the memory card onto his computer, hundreds of images flickered by deer, raccoons, a coyote or two. And then, at 5:12 a.m. on March 9th, 2006, the camera captured something else. A thin, barefoot figure, draped in torn cloth, moving through the trees. 15 seconds of footage. The figure stumbled, paused, turned toward the faint click of the shutter. The face was gaunt, pale but unmistakably female. And to anyone who had studied Hannah Lane's photographs for 7 years, it was her. When Detective Hale first saw the footage, his chest tightened. He replayed it frame by frame, the way she carried herself, the hesitation in her step, the moment her eyes locked on the lens. She recognized it, he whispered. She knew she was being watched. Ivy sat beside him, trembling. That's her, she whispered. That's Hannah. The discovery hit Blackwood like a shockwave. For 7 years, Hannah had been presumed dead. The Stygian Chasm evidence had challenged that. But this was undeniable. Visual proof that she had walked those woods alive in 2006. The image of her profile pale, hollow-eyed, yet unmistakable appeared everywhere. Newspapers, television, missing since October 1999. Last confirmed sighting, March 2006. For Ivy, the photo was both salvation and torment. She carried copies everywhere, plastered them across gas stations and rest stops. She's alive, she told anyone who would listen. If she's alive, she can come home. But the silence remained. Hale built a new task force around the footage. They canvassed every mile between the Stygian Chasm and the cedar grove where the camera had been mounted. Teams combed ridges and riversides. Helicopters circled overhead. Leads poured in. A trucker claiming to see a thin woman near Route 41. A hunter swearing he'd heard a female voice echo in the hollows. But every lead collapsed. Beyond those 15 seconds of footage, Hannah Lane had left nothing. What haunted Hale most was the question of choice. If she was alive, free enough to wander into a camera's frame, why hadn't she sought help? Why hadn't she come out of the woods? During one late-night briefing, Ivy asked the same question, her voice breaking. If she's out there, why hasn't she come back? Is she hurt? Is someone keeping her from us? Hale didn't answer. The silence said enough. The footprints, the radio, the fear in her eyes. And now, the photograph of a woman turning toward the lens, not lost, but wary. To Hale, the implication was chilling. Hannah hadn't returned because she wasn't alone. By 2007, the footage from that trail camera had become legend. Some called it proof of life. Others dismissed it as a trick of light, a gaunt stranger, a coincidence. But for Detective Connor Hale and for Ivy Monroe, it was something else entirely. It was a promise. If Hannah Lane had walked out of those woods once, she could do it again. Still, the years dragged on. The investigation bloated under the weight of false leads and hopeful calls. New crimes stole the headlines. And slowly, Hannah's name slipped once more into silence. Then, in the spring of 2008, the forest whispered again. A ranger patrol exploring a remote sector of the North Ridge, a stretch so overgrown even hunters avoided it, came across the remains of an old structure. A one-room cabin, half its roof collapsed, walls blackened by mildew. Maps identified it as the Iron Vale cabin, abandoned since the 1990s after logging operations had ceased. Inside, beneath years of rot and dust, was evidence of recent use. Ashes in the fireplace, a makeshift cot of burlap and branches, animal bones scattered in a rusted pot, and along one inner wall faint scratches, dozens of tally marks carved with something sharp. Beside them, a message, etched carefully into the wood in handwriting unmistakably human. Don't trust the man near the road. I saw him twice. The script was looping, careful, feminine. It matched samples of Hannah Lane's writing from her college journals, still kept by Ivy. For Detective Hale, the meaning was devastatingly clear. Hannah had survived long after 1999, long enough to find shelter, long enough to carve warnings into wood. She hadn't just endured, she'd been hiding. When Ivy saw photographs of the carvings, she nearly collapsed. "That's her," she whispered. "She wrote that. She was alive." It was proof and horror. Proof that Hannah had lived, and horror that she had lived in fear. Who was the man near the road? Why was she warning others? Ivy launched a new campaign. Flyers now bore not just her sister's face, but the words carved into the cabin wall. Don't trust the man near the road. She demanded public meetings, searched property records, and resurrected an old name that locals had whispered for decades. Silas Cade. To most, Cade was folklore, a hermit said to have lived on the outskirts of Ashenridge through the late 70s and 80s. His cabin had burned in 1982 under suspicious circumstances. Some claimed he'd perished in the fire. Others swore they'd seen him afterward, gaunt, unshaven, drifting through the woods like a shadow. Cade had a record. Old police reports of trespassing, harassment, theft from hikers' camps. Nothing ever serious enough for prison. After the fire, he vanished. Only stories remained. The hermit of Ashenridge, the watcher in the trees. For most, he was myth. For Hale, he was suddenly plausible. "What if he never died?" Ivy asked during one late-night meeting. "What if he's the one she was warning us about?" Hale didn't dismiss it. The theory fit too neatly. A predator surviving in isolation, haunting a stretch of wilderness where women vanished without trace. And then, in late 2009, the woods claimed another. Her name was Nina Drexel, 32, an experienced backpacker who vanished while trekking through the Duskmore Basin, just south of where Hannah had disappeared a decade earlier. Her shallow grave was discovered by chance, exposed by rain that washed away the soil. The autopsy showed blunt force trauma, defensive wounds, and signs of restraint. Unlike Hannah, there was no mystery about Nina's fate. She had been murdered. For Hale, the pattern was undeniable. 3 women, same region, same silence from the forest. He pulled every file from the last 20 years, every missing hiker, every unexplained death. He pinned them across his office wall. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Hannah Lane Stygian Chasm, Tara Calloway Southern Trails, Nina Drexel Duskmore Basin. Each point fell within a narrow geographic corridor, a triangle of wilderness bordered by ridges, rivers, and hollow ground. Hale called it privately the Triangle of Ashenridge. If Silas Cade still lived, this was his hunting ground. When Nina's murder hit the news, Ivy Monroe stood outside the courthouse holding her sister's photo, voice breaking on live television. "They keep saying Hannah is gone," she cried. "But she's not. She's out there, and she was hunted the same way Nina was. How many women have to die before someone believes this is real?" Her grief divided the community. Some stood with her. Others whispered crueler things, that Ivy's obsession had become delusion, that she saw patterns in shadows. But Hale knew better. He'd seen too much. The shaft, the carvings, the footage, the graves. It was no longer theory. Silas Codd, or someone like him, had turned the Ashenridge wilderness into his domain. Through the winter of 2009 and into 2010, Hale worked quietly, chasing fragments of Cade's past. A logging foreman's report from 1981 described a gaunt man stealing food from camps. A park ranger's note from 1985 mentioned locals saying Cade had survived the fire. Every document ended the same way. No arrest, no resolution, just silence. By early 2010, the pieces fit too well to ignore. Hannah Lane had survived her fall in 1999. She had signaled for help. She had carved warnings, and she had been stalked. If Cade was real, he'd been hunting these woods for decades, and Hannah had lived within his reach for over 10 years. Most of Ashenridge had long given up hope. 11 years had passed since Hannah's car was found, since helicopters scoured the trees, since Ivy had become her sister's voice. But the wilderness wasn't finished speaking. In early spring, a small search team surveying near the Hunters Run riverbank noticed something odd, a fire pit half buried in leaves. Inside its ashes lay a strip of teal fabric, scorched but recognizable, the same color as Hannah's jacket. Beside it, 2 sets of footprints hardened in mud, one narrow, barefoot, one larger booted with a hexagonal tread. For Detective Hale, who had spent a decade tracing ghosts, the message was unmistakable. Hannah had been there, and someone else had too. He built what he called a mobility map, connecting every known clue: the Stygian Chasm, the Iron Vale Cabin, the riverbank at Hunter's Run. All paths converged on one place, a section of forest locales called Hallowmere Hollow. It was a place most avoided. Fog hung thick there. The ground swallowed sound. and legend said nothing that entered Hallamere ever truly left. At dawn, Hale led a tactical team into the hollow. For hours they combed the terrain until a ranger's dog barked at a wall of stone. Behind moss and brush, they uncovered something man-made. A wooden door nailed into the hillside, reinforced with scavenged metal. The team breached it. Inside was a narrow tunnel leading to a single chamber. Blankets, jars, a cot, and on it a figure. Thin, pale, breathing. Hannah Lane. For a long moment no one moved. Hale knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked past him into the shadows and whispered, barely audible, "He's watching." Medics rushed her out. The chamber was catalogued. Journals filled with erratic handwriting, sketches of women, phrases about the forest's will. Fingerprints covered the walls. None matched any record. Whoever had lived there, whoever had kept Hannah, was gone, melted back into the trees. At the hospital, Ivy held her sister for the first time in over a decade. The embrace was silent, trembling tears of relief and disbelief. Hannah's voice was weak, her words fragmented. But over weeks of careful care, her story began to emerge. She had fallen into the Stygian chasm in 1999. She'd survived the drop. She'd wedged her radio into the rocks, hoping someone would hear the signal. She'd crawled through the dark until she found an exit. For months, then years, she'd scavenged, built fires, set traps. Eventually she'd found the Iron Veil cabin and carved her warnings after realizing she was not alone. The man had appeared first as a presence. Footsteps outside at night. A pile of berries left by the door. Eyes glinting in the firelight. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words never left her. "The forest wants you," he said. "Don't go back." He was tall, lean, always watching. She thought, though she could never be certain, that he was Silas Cade. In 2006, she'd escaped far enough to trigger the trail camera. But he'd found her again. "Not done," he whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. He brought her back to the chamber in Hallamere Hollow, where she endured years of half-captivity, half-survival. Sometimes he disappeared for weeks. Sometimes he lingered, always watching, always waiting. By 2010, her strength was fading. The fire pit at Hunter's Run had been her last attempt at a signal. If the team hadn't found the hidden door, she might not have survived another winter. For Ivy, her sister's survival was both a miracle and a torment. The Hannah she had carried in memory was now flesh and blood-scarred, but alive. For Connor Hale, the case had reached its truth, but not its closure. He kept the trail camera still on his desk, the frame of Hannah turning her head toward the lens, eyes sharp, aware. That wasn't fear, he thought. That was recognition. The predator who had haunted her for 11 years had vanished without a trace. The fingerprints matched no one. The journals belonged to a ghost, and the forest, as always, kept its secrets. Months later, Ivy drove Hannah back to the old trailhead where her Honda had once been found. The lot was cracked, overgrown with weeds. The trees swayed softly in the wind. Hannah stood at the edge of the forest, the same forest that had trapped her and somehow sustained her. For a moment, it looked like she might step forward into it again. Instead, she turned to Ivy and whispered, her voice steadier now. "I'm here." The forest still held its shadows. The hunter still lingered in legend. But Hannah Lane was no longer a ghost. She was proof that survival is possible, even when the world stops believing. And as for the man she called the Watcher, no one ever found him. Some said he died deep in the hollow. Others said he still roamed, silent, unseen. The truth remains somewhere in the Ashenridge wilderness, where the trees remember everything, and sometimes they don't give it back.